The Galactic Empire was the most powerful force in the known universe. They ruled over 300 different worlds with massive fleets of warships that could destroy entire planets in minutes. For over 2,000 years, no alien species had ever dared to challenge their might. Every creature in the galaxy knew that fighting the Empire meant certain death. Emperor Vaxian sat on his golden throne, made from crystals taken from conquered worlds. He was a tall, blue-skinned alien with 4 arms and glowing red eyes. His palace floated high above the capital planet, surrounded by defensive shields that could stop any attack. The Emperor spent his days reading reports from across the galaxy, and everything always said the same thing: perfect order and complete control. But today something was different. General Kratos, the Empire's best military commander, stood before the throne with news that made the Emperor frown. A rebellion had started on a small planet called Kepler, 442b. In the Outer Rim territories, it should have been nothing more than a minor problem easily solved with a few warships. The rebels were just ordinary aliens, nothing special about them at all. They had basic weapons and no real military training. Yet, somehow they had been fighting Imperial forces for 3 whole months without being defeated. This had never happened before in the entire history of the Empire. General Kratos was a massive creature that looked like a walking tank covered in thick armor plating. He had won every battle he had ever fought using standard Imperial tactics, overwhelming force, and superior technology. But these rebels were different. They fought in ways that made no sense according to everything he knew about warfare. Far away from the galactic capital, on a small blue planet called Earth, an old man named Kim Dojin sat in his tiny apartment in the city of Seoul. He was 70 years old, with gray hair and wrinkled hands that shook slightly when he held his morning cup of coffee. Dojin had been a soldier, once a sergeant in the Korean Special Forces, but that was 50 years ago. Before humans had even made contact with the rest of the galaxy, Dojin was reading the galactic news on his old tablet computer when something caught his attention. The news report described how the rebels on Kepler 442b were using strange new tactics that confused Imperial forces. The reporter called them chaotic and unpredictable, but Dojin recognized them immediately. These were not alien tactics at all. They were human military strategies that he had learned during his time as a soldier. His old heart began to beat faster as he read more details about the rebellion. The rebels were using hit-and-run attacks, disappearing into rough terrain after each strike. They were targeting supply lines instead of fighting big battles. They were using psychological warfare to make Imperial soldiers afraid. These were all things that human armies had been doing for thousands of years. Dojin reached for his ancient communication device, a relic from his military days that still worked perfectly. He began making calls to old friends scattered across Earth, men who had served with him in the Special Forces decades ago. The first call went to Park Young-sik, who lived in the coastal city of Busan. Young-sik answered on the second ring, his voice still strong despite his 72 years of age. He had been Dojin's best friend during their service together, and they had stayed in contact even after retiring from the military. When Dojin explained what he had discovered about the rebellion, Young-sik was silent for a long moment. The next call went to Lee Junho, who lived on Jeju Island, where he ran a small fishing boat. Junho had been the smartest soldier in their unit, always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He understood immediately what Dojin was saying about the rebel tactics and agreed that something needed to be done. The final call was to Nam Tae-hyung, an Incheon who had become an electronics expert after leaving the military. Tae-hyung had always been good with technology and communications equipment. During their service, he had been the one who coordinated radio messages between different units when all 4 men were connected on the same channel. Dojin spoke the words that would change galactic history. Brothers, our children need us. None of them asked what he meant. They all understood that somewhere in the galaxy, the descendants of aliens they had once helped were now fighting for their freedom against impossible odds. Decades ago, when Earth had first made contact with the galactic community, many alien refugees had come to their planet. Some were running from wars, others from persecution. Earth had welcomed them, and human military instructors had taught them how to defend themselves. These refugees had eventually returned to space, carrying human knowledge with them. Now their children and grandchildren were scattered across many different worlds. Some had ended up on Kepler 442b, where they were fighting the Empire using tactics their ancestors had learned from human soldiers. But they were missing something important. They had the basic knowledge, but not the experience and wisdom that came from actually fighting wars. The 4 old Korean veterans began preparing for a journey that would take them across the galaxy to help people they had never met. Their bodies were old, and their reflexes were slower than they once were. But their minds were still sharp as steel blades filled with decades of military knowledge and experience. They gathered their old equipment, much of it ancient by galactic standards but still functional. Dojin packed his tactical manuals, written in Korean and translated into several alien languages. Yongsik collected his survival gear designed for fighting in harsh environments. Junho assembled his psychological warfare materials, including propaganda techniques and enemy analysis methods. Taehyung gathered communication equipment, both human and alien technology, as they worked. The 4 friends talked about the old days when they had been young soldiers fighting in Earth conflicts that the galaxy knew nothing about, while other alien species had been living in peace under imperial rule for thousands of years. Humans had been perfecting the art of warfare through constant conflict. They remembered battles where small groups of soldiers had defeated much larger enemies through clever tactics and determination. They recalled how human armies had always been outnumbered, but had found ways to win through superior strategy and adaptability. These were lessons that no other species in the galaxy had ever needed to learn. The old veterans knew that their journey would be dangerous. The Empire did not tolerate interference in their affairs, and humans were still considered a minor species with limited rights in galactic society. But they also knew that they possessed knowledge that could change the course of the rebellion. As night fell over Seoul, the 4 men made their final preparations. Tomorrow they would begin a journey that would take them to the edge of known space to fight in a war that most of the galaxy believed was already lost, but they were not worried. They had faced impossible odds before, and they had always found a way to win. Captain Han Minjun was checking cargo manifests at the Seoul spaceport when 4 old men approached his ship. The Seoul Pride Minjun was 40 years old and had been flying cargo runs between Earth and other worlds for 15 years. He knew every type of passenger that usually booked passage on interstellar flights, but these men were different. The leader of the group was Kim Dojin, a gray-haired man who walked with the straight posture of an old soldier. Despite his age, there was something in his eyes that made Minjun pay attention. When Dojin spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the kind of authority that came from years of command. "We need passage to the Kepler system," Dojin said simply. "We can pay in full, and we won't cause any trouble." Minjun almost laughed. The Kepler system was in the middle of a war zone. No civilian ships were supposed to go there, and the Imperial Navy was stopping all traffic in that sector. But something about these old men made him hesitate, instead of immediately refusing. Dojin reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that Minjun recognized as a military identification scanner. When the old man activated it and handed it over, Minjun's eyes widened in shock. The device contained classified Earth military records showing that all 4 men were decorated veterans with the highest security clearances. These were not ordinary old men. They were legends from the early days of Earth's military history, heroes from wars that had been fought before. Humanity had even known that other intelligent species existed. Their service records showed decades of combat experience in conflicts across Earth. Captain Minjun immediately agreed to take them, though he was worried about their safety. The journey to Kepler 442b would take 3 weeks through hyperspace, and they would have to pass through several Imperial checkpoints along the way. Any ship caught trying to help the rebels would be destroyed without warning, as the Seoul Pride lifted off from Earth and entered hyperspace. The 4 veterans settled into the cargo bay, which they had converted into a makeshift command center. They spread out star charts and began studying everything they could find about the current situation on Kepler. 442b Park Yongsik had brought several old projectile weapons from his personal collection. They were ancient by galactic standards, using chemical explosives instead of energy beams, but they were completely reliable and easy to maintain. He spent hours cleaning and checking each weapon while explaining their advantages to his friends. "Most aliens have never seen projectile weapons," Yongsik said as he worked. The Empire designs their shields to stop energy beams and plasma bolts. A simple bullet, moving fast enough, can go right through their defenses because they don't expect it. Li Junho was studying intelligence reports about Imperial military tactics and formations. Everything he read confirmed what they had suspected. The Empire fought like a machine with predictable patterns and rigid procedures. They had never faced an enemy that used chaos and unpredictability as weapons. The Empire has ruled for so long that they have forgotten how to adapt. Junho explained to the others. They expect their enemies to fight according to galactic military standards. When someone breaks those rules, they don't know how to respond. Nam Taihyung had set up communication equipment that could monitor Imperial military channels without being detected. He was listening to status reports from the Kepler system, and the news was not good. The rebels were losing ground steadily, and their morale was dropping. Our people down there are fighting bravely, Taihyung reported, but they are missing something. They have the heart to fight, but they don't have the knowledge of how to win against a superior enemy. During the long journey through hyperspace, the four friends shared stories and planned their strategy. They talked about battles they had fought on Earth, where small units had defeated much larger forces through superior tactics and psychological warfare. Dojin reminded them of a battle from their youth where their special forces unit had been surrounded by enemy forces with superior numbers and better equipment. They had escaped by doing something completely unexpected, abandoning all their heavy gear and moving through terrain that everyone thought was impassable. That is what we need to teach them. Dojin said, the Empire expects rebels to fight like soldiers following military rules, but we will teach them to fight like humans who will do anything to survive. As they approached the Kepler system, Imperial scanners detected their ship and demanded identification. Captain Minjun responded that they were carrying medical supplies for civilian populations, which was technically true since they had loaded some basic medical equipment, as Cover General Krathos himself questioned them over the communication channel. His image appeared on the ship's main screen, showing his massive armored form and glowing red eyes. He studied the four old humans carefully but dismissed them as harmless merchants. This was his first serious mistake. The Soul Pride received clearance to land at a small spaceport that was supposedly under Imperial control, but as soon as they entered the atmosphere, Captain Minjun changed course. Following coordinates that Taehyung had obtained from rebel communication channels, they landed at a hidden base, built into mountain caves far from any Imperial outposts. The landing pad was concealed under camouflage netting, and the entire base was designed to be invisible from orbit. Rebel guards met them at the landing pad, but instead of treating them as strangers, the guards bowed respectfully. The alien rebels were descendants of creatures that humans had helped decades ago when Earth first made contact with the galactic community. They had heard stories passed down through generations about the human soldiers who had taught their ancestors how to fight. Among the rebel leaders was a female named Kira, who belonged to a species that looked like large cats but walked upright on two legs. She had been chosen as a commander because of her intelligence and courage, but she lacked the military experience needed to defeat Imperial forces. When Kira saw the four old Korean veterans, her eyes filled with tears of hope. The elders have come, she whispered to her fellow rebels, just like the old stories said they would when we needed them most. The rebels led their visitors deep into the mountain base where hundreds of different alien species were working together, united in their desire for freedom from Imperial rule. They had good weapons that they had captured from Imperial forces, and they had brave hearts willing to fight against impossible odds. But as Dojin watched the rebels training and preparing for battle, he could see what was missing. They fought like the galaxy had taught them to fight with clean tactics and clear rules of engagement. They treated war like it was some kind of organized sport, with winners and losers determined by who had better equipment. That night, as the four veterans settled into quarters provided by the rebels, they talked quietly about what they had observed. The rebels had everything they needed to win except for the most important thing, the knowledge of how to fight dirty when survival was at stake. Tomorrow they would begin teaching these brave aliens the ancient human arts of warfare tactics that had been developed through thousands of years of constant conflict on Earth. They would show them that war was not a game played by rules but a struggle for survival, where only the clever and adaptable could hope to win. The mountain base buzzed with activity as dawn broke over Kepler 442b. Hundreds of rebel fighters from dozens of different alien species were preparing for another day of resistance against the Empire. They had established a well-organized camp, with training areas, weapon storage and communication centers, but Kim Do-jin could see immediately that something was wrong. The rebels fought like they were playing a complex game with rules that everyone was supposed to follow. They lined up in neat formations when they practiced combat. They attacked targets head-on, using the most direct approaches possible. They even warned their enemies before launching major attacks, because Galactic military tradition said this was the honorable thing. Do-jin gathered the rebel commanders in the main briefing cave where crude maps were drawn on the rocky walls. He looked at each alien face around the circle, seeing courage and determination, but also a kind of innocent belief that wars could be won through superior virtue and better equipment. You fight like you are playing a game, he told them in simple words that everyone could understand. War is not a game. War is survival. When you fight to survive, you do whatever it takes to win you. Do not worry about being fair or honorable. You worry about going home alive. The alien commanders shifted uncomfortably at these words. They had been taught by Galactic society that warfare should follow certain rules, that there were right ways and wrong ways to fight. But these old human soldiers were suggesting something completely different. The 4 Korean veterans split up to work with different groups of rebels, each focusing on the skills they knew best. Park Young-sik took charge of teaching guerrilla tactics to small strike teams. He led them to rough terrain outside the base, where he showed them how to use the environment as a weapon. Your enemy has better guns and stronger armor, Young-sik explained as he demonstrated how to set up an ambush. But they also have to travel on roads and paths to move their heavy equipment. You can choose where to fight them and when to disappear. He taught them how to dig hidden shelters that were invisible from above, how to create false trails that led Imperial patrols into traps, and how to attack supply convoys when they were most vulnerable. The rebels learned quickly because their survival depended on it. Lee Junho focused on psychological warfare, which was completely unknown in Galactic military doctrine. He worked with communication specialists to create propaganda that would spread fear and confusion among Imperial forces, instead of trying to defeat them through direct combat. Your enemy is strong because they believe they cannot be beaten, Junho explained. But if you make them afraid, if you make them doubt themselves, they become weak, even with all their advanced weapons. He showed them how to hack Imperial communication systems to broadcast confusing messages, how to leave evidence of rebel activities in places where Imperial forces would find them, and how to make small attacks that created the impression of a much larger rebel army. Nam Tae-hyung worked with the technical teams to revolutionize their communication and information gathering systems. The rebels had been using standard Galactic equipment, which was advanced but also predictable. Imperial forces knew how to track and jam these systems. Tae-hyung introduced them to old human techniques for maintaining communication without being detected. He showed them how to build simple radio equipment that Imperial scanners could not recognize, and how to create code systems based on seemingly innocent everyday messages. But Kim Do-jin took on the most difficult task of all, teaching the rebel commanders how to think like human warriors. He gathered them around fires each evening and told them stories of battles from Earth history, where smaller forces had defeated huge armies through cleverness and determination. He told them about ancient Korean generals who had defeated Chinese invasions by using tactics that their enemies could not predict. He described modern special forces operations, where small teams had accomplished missions that entire armies could not complete. He shared the wisdom that came from thousands of years of human warfare experience. Your ancestors knew these things. Once he explained to Kira and the other rebel leaders. But the galaxy made you forget peace, made you soft. The Empire wants you to fight fair because they always win fair fights. The lessons were hard for the rebels to accept at first. Many of them had moral objections to fighting dirty. They believed that using deception and surprise attacks was somehow wrong, that honorable warriors should announce their intentions and fight openly. But as weeks passed and they began to see results, their attitudes started to change. Small rebel units using guerrilla tactics began successfully attacking. Imperial Patrol's supply convoys started disappearing without trace. Communication networks were disrupted by confusing false messages. General Krathos noticed these changes immediately. His organized military machine was being frustrated by what seemed like random chaos. Rebel attacks came from unexpected directions at unpredictable times. Imperial forces found themselves jumping at shadows, afraid that any routine patrol might turn into a deadly ambush. The general increased security patrols and tightened communication protocols, but this only made the situation worse. The rebels seemed to know exactly how Imperial forces would respond to each new security measure. It was as if they could predict every move the Empire would make. Li Shunyo smiled as he watched Imperial troops march into another carefully planned trap. Predictable, he muttered to himself. Just like we thought they would be. The rebel base became a school where ancient human military wisdom was passed on to alien students who had never imagined that war could be fought in so many different ways. The old Korean veterans worked tirelessly, sharing knowledge that their species had accumulated through millennia of constant conflict. Kira proved to be an especially quick student. She had a natural talent for tactical thinking, and she understood instinctively why human methods were so effective against Imperial forces. Her own people began calling her the Shadow Leader, because she had learned to strike without warning and disappear without trace. Other rebel commanders also embraced the human way of fighting. A massive creature named Thorak, who looked like a walking boulder, learned to use his size and strength in unexpected ways instead of charging directly at enemies. A small flying alien called Zephyr became expert at reconnaissance and sabotage, using his natural abilities in new ways. As the training continued, the rebels began to develop their own variations on human tactics. They combined their natural abilities with human strategy to create new forms of warfare that even the old veterans had never seen before. The mountain base transformed from a hiding place into a military academy where the ancient arts of human warfare were taught to a new generation of fighters. These aliens were learning that survival sometimes required abandoning honor, that victory was more important than fighting fair, and that the strong could be defeated by the clever news of successful rebel operations began to spread to other worlds where Imperial rule was being questioned. For the first time in galactic history, the Empire was being challenged by enemies who refused to follow the accepted rules of warfare. Emperor Vaxian stood in his war room staring at holographic displays that showed rebel activity across multiple star systems. What had started as a minor problem on one small planet was now spreading like a disease throughout his carefully ordered empire. The rebellion on Kepler 442b should have been crushed months ago, but instead it had become an inspiration for dissidents everywhere. The Emperor was not just angry, he was genuinely confused. His military advisors could not explain what was happening. The rebels were using tactics that made no sense according to established galactic military doctrine. They fought without honor, attacked without warning, and disappeared without engaging in proper battles. General Krathos stood before the throne, his massive armored form somehow seeming smaller than usual. His red eyes were dimmed with shame as he delivered his report. The rebels have changed, Your Majesty. They no longer fight like civilized beings. They use chaos and deception like wild animals. This comparison to wild animals was meant as an insult, but it actually frightened the Emperor more than anything else. The Empire had ruled for 2,000 years by imposing order on chaos, by forcing all species to follow the same military traditions and rules of engagement. But these rebels were rejecting civilization itself. Admiral Nixara entered the war room, her reptilian features twisted into an expression of cold determination. She was known throughout the galaxy as the Empress of Destruction because she had never lost a single battle. Her fleet had burned entire worlds to ash when their populations refused to submit to imperial rule. Your Majesty, she said in her hissing voice, give me 200 warships and permission to destroy the entire Kepler system. I will end this rebellion permanently and send a message to every other world that might consider following their example. The Emperor considered this option carefully. Destroying an entire star system would certainly end the rebellion, but it would also destroy valuable resources and potentially create more problems. The other species in the galaxy were already nervous about Imperial power, and such extreme action might provoke even more rebellions. But what choice did he have? The rebellion was spreading and traditional military responses were failing. The rebels seemed to anticipate every Imperial move and counter it with something unexpected. Every victory the Empire achieved was temporary, while rebel successes inspired others to join the resistance. Give Admiral Nexara everything she needs, the Emperor commanded. Burn that system to nothing if necessary. But end this rebellion before it spreads any further. Admiral Nexara departed immediately to assemble the largest battle fleet in Imperial history. 200 warships of various classes, including massive dreadnoughts capable of cracking planets in half. The fleet also carried orbital bombardment weapons that could sterilize entire continents from space. Meanwhile, in the mountain caves of Kepler 442b, the rebel commanders detected the approaching fleet through their network of hidden sensors. Nam Taehyung reported the news to a gathering of all rebel leaders, his voice steady. Despite the terrifying implications of what he was seeing, many rebels wanted to flee immediately. The approaching Imperial fleet was larger than anything they had ever faced before. Even with their new tactics and improved fighting skills, they could not hope to defeat 200 warships in direct combat. But the 4 old Korean veterans remained calm. Kim Dojin looked around at the frightened alien faces and spoke in his quiet but commanding voice that had reassured soldiers in desperate situations many times before. They think big fleets make them powerful, he said, but big fleets also make big targets. We will show them what 4 old men learned in the wars of Earth. The veterans had not been idle during the months of training rebel forces. They had been working on a secret project deep in the mountain caves using both human engineering knowledge and alien technology to build something that had never existed before in galactic history, while the rebels had been learning guerrilla tactics and psychological warfare. The old soldiers had been constructing a planetary defense system based on human military principles. Instead of trying to match Imperial firepower, they had built weapons designed to exploit the weaknesses of traditional galactic warfare. Park Young-sik had overseen construction of hundreds of railgun emplacements hidden throughout the mountain ranges. These weapons used electromagnetic acceleration to fire solid projectiles at incredible speeds. They were primitive compared to Imperial energy weapons, but they were also completely invisible to standard military sensors. Lee Junho had designed a network of false sensor readings and holographic projectors that could make the planet appear empty to orbital scans. The system was based on human deception techniques adapted for use against alien technology. Nam Taehyung had created a communication network that was completely separate from galactic standard systems. It used old human radio technology that Imperial scanners were not programmed to detect. This allowed rebel forces to coordinate their actions without being monitored. Kim Dojin had planned the overall strategy, turning the entire planet into a trap that would use the Empire's own tactics against them. The approaching fleet would expect to face desperate rebels begging for mercy. Instead, they would encounter something that no Imperial force had ever seen before. As Admiral Nexara's fleet entered the Kepler system, they found exactly what they expected to find according to their sensors. The planet appeared to be completely lifeless, with no energy signatures, no communication signals, and no signs of military activity. The Admiral was suspicious but not particularly worried. She had dealt with hiding enemies before, and she had brought enough firepower to destroy the entire planet if necessary. Her ships took standard Imperial formations in orbit, preparing to begin systematic bombardment. "This is your final warning to any rebels listening," she broadcast on all frequencies. "Surrender immediately or face complete destruction. You have 1 hour to respond." But no response came from the silent planet below. Admiral Nexara smiled, showing her razor-sharp teeth. These aliens would learn the price of defying Imperial authority. She gave the order for her fleet to begin bombardment and waited to watch another world burn. Instead, something happened that no Imperial commander had ever experienced in 2,000 years of galactic dominance. The planet fired back. The mountains of Kepler 442b erupted with weapon fire, but it was unlike anything Admiral Nexara had ever seen. These were not the clean energy beams and plasma bolts that characterized galactic warfare. Instead, the planet launched a swarm of solid projectiles that moved faster than Imperial sensors could track. Park Yongsik's railgun network, activated simultaneously from hundreds of hidden positions throughout the mountain ranges. Each weapon fired dense metal slugs accelerated by electromagnetic fields to incredible velocities. The slugs were simple pieces of hardened alloy with no guidance systems or explosive warheads, but they struck with the force of meteorites. Imperial shields flickered and failed as projectiles passed right through energy barriers designed to stop beam weapons. The Empire had not faced kinetic weapons in thousands of years, and their defensive systems were completely unprepared for this ancient form of warfare. 3 Imperial destroyers were crippled in the first volley as railgun slugs punched through their hulls like paper. The crews aboard those ships had never experienced actual damage to their vessels. Imperial technology was supposed to make their ships invulnerable to primitive planetary defenses. Admiral Nexara stared in shock at her tactical displays as damage reports flooded in from across her fleet. This was impossible. According to everything she knew about military science, a planet should not be able to threaten a full Imperial battle fleet, especially not with primitive projectile weapons. But Li Junho's deception network was just beginning to show its capabilities. Holographic projectors throughout the planet created false sensor readings that made Imperial ships see threats that did not exist while hiding real dangers until it was too late to avoid them. Imperial captains found their instruments showing contradictory information. Some sensors detected massive enemy formations, while others showed empty space communication. Officers reported receiving orders from Admiral Nexara that she had never given weapons officers targeted enemy ships that turned out to be illusions. The carefully organized Imperial fleet began to lose formation as individual ships tried to respond to threats that their sensors were reporting. Some captains ordered evasive maneuvers while others pressed forward, creating collisions and confusion within their own ranks. Nam Taehyung's communication jamming system added to the chaos by flooding Imperial frequencies with false information and contradictory orders. Ships received multiple different sets of instructions, all apparently from legitimate command sources. The rigid Imperial command structure could not function when no one could tell which orders were real. From hidden bases scattered across the planet's surface, swarms of small missiles rose toward the Imperial fleet. These were not sophisticated guided weapons, but simple rockets carrying chemical explosive warheads. They were too numerous and too small for Imperial point defense systems to stop effectively. The missiles had been built using human engineering principles, focusing on reliability and mass production rather than advanced technology. Each one carried just enough explosive to damage ship systems or kill crew members. They were designed to overwhelm Imperial defenses through sheer numbers. Imperial ships found themselves surrounded by thousands of small explosions as the missile swarms reached their targets. The individual warheads were not powerful enough to destroy major warships, but they damaged sensors, communications equipment, and weapon systems. Death came from 1,000 small cuts rather than a few large wounds. Admiral Nexara tried to regain control of the battle by ordering her fleet to retreat to safer positions and regroup. But the rebels had anticipated this move as well. Mines that had been deployed weeks earlier throughout the system, activated as Imperial ships, tried to maneuver. These were not traditional space mines, but human-designed traps that used the Empire's own movement patterns against them. The mines had been positioned where Imperial military doctrine said ships should move when under attack. Every retreat route and defensive position had been mined in advance. Kim Dojin watched the battle from deep underground, coordinating rebel forces through old-fashioned radio equipment that Imperial scanners could not detect. His aged face showed no emotion, but his eyes were bright with satisfaction as he saw decades of military experience being put to use. This is how humans fight, he explained to Kira, who was learning to coordinate different rebel groups from a command center hidden in the deepest caves, not with the biggest guns but with the smartest plans. We used the enemy's strength against them. The Imperial fleet was trapped between the planet's surface weapons and the minefields in space. Unable to advance or retreat safely, they were forced to fight on terms chosen by their enemies for the first time in Imperial history. Some Imperial captains tried to use their ship's main weapons to bombard the planet from long range, but the rebels had prepared for this as well. Hidden Deflector shields based on human defensive concepts absorbed and redirected energy beams back toward the Imperial fleet. Other captains attempted to land troops on the surface to hunt down the rebel weapons, but ground forces found themselves facing an enemy that refused to fight fair ambushes, traps, and hit-and-run attacks, made it impossible for Imperial soldiers to establish secure positions. Admiral Nexara realized that she was not fighting ordinary rebels anymore. These tactics were completely unknown in galactic military history. Her fleet was being systematically destroyed by enemies who seemed to anticipate every Imperial response. She sent an emergency message to Emperor Vaxian using a coded channel that she hoped the rebels had not compromised. The message was brief, but its implications were staggering. Request immediate reinforcements and complete tactical analysis. Something is very wrong here. We are not fighting normal aliens. Back in the Imperial capital, Emperor Vaxian received the message with growing horror. His most experienced admiral commanding his most powerful fleet was asking for help against a single planet of rebels. This had never happened before in the entire history of the Empire. Intelligence reports began arriving that painted an even more disturbing picture. The 4 old humans on Kepler 442b had been identified and their true backgrounds revealed. They were veterans of wars that had been fought before the galaxy even knew Earth existed. The Emperor began to understand that his empire was facing something it had never encountered before. These were not just rebels fighting for freedom. These were students of the most warlike species in the galaxy, taught by masters of an ancient and terrible art. The battle for Kepler 442b was not just about one small rebellion anymore. It was about whether the ordered civilization of the galaxy could survive contact with the chaotic warfare traditions of humanity. And for the first time in 2,000 years, the Empire was losing. News of Admiral Nexara's defeat spread across the galaxy, faster than the speed of light. Imperial communication networks carried reports of the impossible battle to every corner of civilized space. Within hours, billions of aliens knew that the invincible Empire had been humiliated by rebels on a single small planet. The battle recordings somehow found their way onto every major information network in the galaxy, despite Imperial attempts to suppress them. Alien species that had lived under Imperial rule for thousands of years watched in amazement as they saw new kinds of warfare that made no sense according to everything they had been taught on the Imperial capital world. Emperor Vaxian summoned every military advisor and strategic analyst. In his government, he needed answers about what had happened at Kepler 442b, but none of his experts could explain the rebel tactics they had witnessed in the recordings. The rebels fight like wild animals, complained General Krathos. They use no formations, no strategy, no honor. They attack from everywhere and nowhere. They make war itself into chaos. But Imperial intelligence officers were beginning to piece together a more frightening truth. The tactics used by the rebels were not random chaos at all. They were highly sophisticated strategies that had been developed over thousands of years by a species that had never known peace. The 4 old humans on Kepler 442b were identified through Imperial databases as veterans of conflicts that had occurred before galactic contact. Their service records revealed participation in wars that involved billions of casualties, tactics that defied every rule of civilized warfare, and victories achieved against impossible odds. Earth was not the primitive backwater world that the Empire had always believed it to be. Instead, it was a planet of warriors that had been hiding its true nature for decades. Human military history stretched back through millennia of constant warfare, developing strategies and tactics that no other species had ever needed to learn. Emperor Vaxian read the intelligence reports with growing dread as he began to understand what his empire was really facing. Humans had been fighting wars while other species lived in peace. They had perfected the art of violence while everyone else had forgotten that such things were even possible. The defeat at Kepler 442b was not just a military setback. It was proof that there were forms of warfare that Imperial forces could not counter, strategies that had been developed by a species that treated conflict as a way of life, rather than an unfortunate necessity. Across the galaxy, rebellions exploded on dozens of worlds as news of the Imperial defeat inspired resistance movements. Everywhere, alien populations that had accepted Imperial rule for generations suddenly began to believe that freedom was possible. Each new rebellion used tactics that had been learned from the Kepler rebels, tactics that originated from four old Korean soldiers who had shared the accumulated military wisdom of their entire species. Revolutionary leaders studied the battle recordings and adapted human strategies to their own situations. On the industrial world of Vega Prime, factory workers organized themselves into guerrilla cells that sabotaged Imperial production facilities. In the asteroid mining colonies of the Centauri system, miners used knowledge of underground tunnels to create hidden bases that Imperial forces could not find. The ocean world of Aquaria saw its amphibious population begin hit-and-run attacks against Imperial shipping, using submarines that Imperial sensors could not detect. The forest worlds of the Elm sector became hunting grounds where Imperial patrols disappeared without trace. Every rebellion was different, but they all shared the same fundamental approach that had been taught by the Korean veterans. They refused to fight fair, they used deception and surprise as weapons, and they turned the Empire's own strength against itself. Back on Earth, recruitment centers opened for the first time in decades, as young humans volunteered to help liberate alien worlds. The galactic community was finally learning that humans were not just another peaceful species but warriors whose ancestors had been fighting for survival since the dawn of history. Kim Do-jin received reports of the spreading rebellions through hidden communication channels that connected rebels across the galaxy. He sat in his command cave deep beneath the mountains of Kepler 442b, reading messages from dozens of worlds where aliens were learning to fight like humans. The old veteran smiled as he realized what he and his friends had started. They had not just won a single battle or even saved a single planet. They had introduced the galaxy to a form of warfare that would change everything. Kira approached him with the latest intelligence reports showing Imperial fleets retreating from multiple systems as rebellions grew stronger everywhere. The Empire was losing control as their rigid military doctrine proved inadequate against enemies who refused to follow traditional rules. The elders have given us something more valuable than victory, she said. To Do-jin, they have given us hope, and the knowledge that even the strongest enemy can be defeated. Park Young-sik was training new groups of rebels who had arrived from other worlds, bringing stories of successful attacks against Imperial forces. His guerrilla tactics were being adapted and modified by alien fighters who added their own species' natural abilities to human military knowledge. Lee Junho was coordinating psychological warfare campaigns across multiple star systems as rebel propagandists used human techniques to spread fear and confusion among Imperial forces. The rigid Imperial mindset was proving vulnerable to the kind of mental warfare that humans had perfected over centuries. Nam Tai-hyung was helping establish communication networks that linked rebel groups across the galaxy, creating a coordination system that Imperial intelligence could not penetrate. The Empire was fighting dozens of separate rebellions that were secretly working together in the depths of space. On worlds throughout the galaxy, other old human soldiers began receiving messages asking for their help. Veterans who had thought their fighting days were over packed their gear and prepared to share their knowledge with alien students. The Empire had ruled through fear and superior technology, believing that their advanced weapons and organized fleets made them invincible. But they had never faced an enemy that fought with the wisdom of ages, that turned their own strength against them, and that refused to accept defeat. The four old Korean veterans had reminded the galaxy that sometimes experience and cunning could triumph over any amount of technological superiority. They had started a revolution that would spread to every corner of civilized space. And as Emperor Vaxian watched his ordered empire begin to crumble under the assault of chaotic warfare, he finally understood the truth. Humanity was not just another species in the galactic community. They were the children of war itself, and they had finally come home to teach the galaxy what real conflict looked like. The age of imperial peace was ending, and the age of human warfare had begun.